Good morning, and welcome to this K-12 Educators Workshop. I'm Liz Layfelt. I'm the Vice President of the Teaching Division of the American Historical Association. That's a bit of a mouthful, but basically Teaching Division oversees a host of activities connected to teaching and learning across the spectrum of education. History education. As you probably are well aware, particularly if you've sort of stuck a toe into this year's annual meeting, the AHA is a pretty vast organization. It serves a lot of constituencies, it provides a lot of services, it does advocacy work in a variety of areas, it upholds the standards of the profession and the discipline, and these sorts of things. And that vastness then makes it a very diverse organization, which I think is definitely one of its strengths, its ability to sort of speak across these various groups that have a stake in history and how it is done, particularly here in the United States. Increasingly, though, I think a core of that strength is the fact that we are seeing more and more sessions like this one taking place at our annual meeting. There was a time way back in the dark ages when I was a graduate student when you didn't go to AHA to go to a session on teaching. You went to AHA to interview for jobs and maybe attend a few sessions in your research area. And I think that has changed, and I think that is a change for the better. I think we are a stronger organization for our increasing emphasis on teaching and learning and holding sessions on those things at the annual meeting, as well as sponsoring activities throughout the year in a variety of locations. But I think it's very emblematic of where the organization has come to, that there are more of these sessions at the annual meeting. If you were to pick up the program or the online version of the program, we have an app, and simply do a search for K through 12 or K through 16 or teaching or learning, you would get an enormous number of hits. If anything, you would be hard pressed to choose which sessions you wanted to attend because there are so many good offerings at the annual meeting. And this is one of them. We have, for a period of time now, made a commitment to having a workshop like this attached to the annual meeting, where we are very specifically targeting you, K through 12 educators, and trying to provide you with resources, the opportunity to network, to share best practices, to brainstorm new ideas. And so we will continue to do this in the years to come. But as I stand here as the Vice President of the Teaching Division, I want to very explicitly say to you and your peers and colleagues that we want to know what we can be doing for you in addition to this, and that we take very seriously the feedback that we get from members, from people who participate in the activities that we sponsor. And so I would ask you to ponder, as you do the work you're about to do today, what can the Teaching Division of the American Historical Association be doing for you? What can we do better? How can we better serve you? And I will warn you that I'm not able to stay for the entire workshop. One of the joys of being the vice president is you have to like bilocate and run around and go to lots of activities. But I am going to leave copies of my business card here that have my email address. I am really serious when I say I want to hear from you. It's not sort of an empty promise and then I'm going to disappear an hour from now, never to be seen again. So please, I'll put it somewhere central. Grab a business card or talk to me during a break if I'm still here, if there's any feedback that you'd like to share with me. I'm going to close by thanking a few people and then inviting somebody else to make a few brief remarks before you get down to the business of what you're here to do. I want to thank Brenda Santos and Emily Swafford, who put lots of hours and lots of work into creating this workshop. So they they make teaching division look good at moments like this, and I'm very grateful for the hard work that they've put in to creating this opportunity. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Lawrence Cherub from the College Board, who is a sponsor of this activity, to make a few remarks.
Thank you, Liz. I wanted to welcome everybody here on behalf of the Advanced Placement Program of the College Board. My name is Lawrence Cherub. I'm the Senior Director for the AP History and Social Sciences group in the Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment team. And that is to say having the group that works on all kinds of curriculum and instruction issues affecting AP US History, AP World History, and AP European History. This is several years now we've been able to be the sponsor of this workshop, and we are very, very pleased to have that opportunity to provide this for you. And I think that what's exciting about it from our perspective is that it's really a model of the kind of interaction between higher ed and history teaching that the Advanced Placement Program is created to foster. We have many models of that kind of collaboration within the structures of the College Board. We have committees of professors and stellar teachers. Several of the people who are here have actually been involved in those committees, in our development committees for the AP program. And it's something that we see as a really core model for how to connect these two different groups, which especially in history have historically had a difficult time being in contact with each other, to really come together and improve the understanding and teaching of history for our students, which is what we all care about very deeply. I wanted to also say that this is a continuation of a partnership that we've had with AHA over the past few years. One of the best resources I think that we have right now for teachers is a set of interactive online modules in which professors and teachers of U.S. history provide both a research overview and a pedagogical overview of the different periods of the AP U.S. history course. And we are in the process of building those same kinds of resources out for European and world history at the moment and making them available. So there's a lot of things that are in there in terms of like other ways we have those kinds of partnerships. But what was especially important about what we were able to do with U.S. history was working with professors who were referred to us by the AHA. And really providing stellar models of the scholarship that's going on right now in American history, and thinking about how that could be made useful and come alive in the classroom for AP students. So again, this partnership is really critical, and we're just so thrilled to be able to have you here to be able to experience it. And I also have a session at 10:30 that is also a College Board sponsored session. And so I will also be leaving, but I will do the same thing of leaving my business card. I am at lcharap, L-C-H-A-R-A-P, at collegeboard.org. If you have any questions at all, if you're curious about what kind of resources that are out there to help you in teaching AP, if you're a teacher or faculty member who's interested in becoming a reader at the AP reading in June, any of those kinds of means, I'd be very happy to talk with you and provide whatever help I possibly can. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. I'm just going to say one thing after thanking Emily. I forgot to do the one thing she asked me to do, which was to ask everybody to sign in. So please be sure to. They did. Oh, they did. Well, excellent. But if you have not signed in, please be sure before you leave today to sign in so that we have a record of who was here and who participated. Thank you.
Okay. So, howdy, everybody. Howdy is. I don't know if it's actually, I think, more of a Southern word than Western. But I was so moved about 4 or 5 months ago, one of our Nobel Prize winners on campus, Eric Cornell, who's a physicist, who's a wonderful guy, he came towards me and he said, Patty, I have to tell you, I've been here 25 years in the West, and I can really tell that it's changed me because now when I greet people, I'm saying howdy. So I figure if a Nobel Prize winner has gone in that direction, that we have to go there too. So howdy. Howdy. See, it's all right. So I think actually, because I don't have a PowerPoint, I think we might get a little bit out of the gloom if we, just for the next few minutes, if it's easy to make that change. So I am giving the opening, I'm sort of warm up act for the actual activity of taking on documents and thinking about them. I am a historic artifact myself. My papers are here at the Denver Public Library, so if we'd chosen to have a very tedious morning, we could have taken out artifacts from my personal correspondence and looked at that, which I don't think I put any restrictions on it, which other people are smart enough to do, I guess. So anyway, so those are available to people who want to do research here, and more of those keep arriving all the time. I really had a great birth date of being born in 1951, so that when I was getting out of graduate school in the early 80s, the timing was absolutely right to notice that there was a critical mass of articles and books that simply did not fit in the existing frameworks for Western American history. And I'm not sure if I remembered to thank my parents for the birth date when I realized that, but there was such good fortune in that timing. So the book, The Legacy of Conquest, was really made possible by so many other people just doing monographs, focused, specialized studies, but when you added them up, it didn't work for any version of the Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis, Ray Allen Billington's revival of the Frontier Thesis, and the book Westward Expansion. When I was in graduate school, that was still the kind of textbook. Ray Allen Billington and Martin Bridge, Westward Expansion. The chapter on Indians was called The Indian Barrier. Well, now that's interesting. It's a nice way to think of people. That's the way I always try to think of people. Actually, I've never done that, to my knowledge. The chapter on Spanish settlement, Mexican settlement, the Spanish barrier. So, and then the cutest thing that ever happened in a textbook, I think it was for the 1968 edition, someone had, I guess they had heard enough that it was not totally historically accurate to have only men in the book. So they had done this most wonderful revision. It's so funny. I actually have the quotations if you ever want to use them, where they simply kept exactly the same language they'd had before, and they inserted "and women." So it's a little bit hard on the typesetter, but really otherwise, there's not a lot of exertion that goes into that. And it's so funny, and it's actually pretty fun to use. I should have brought it today, because, well, you don't need that, but it's really fun because if you read the sentence and pause and have the audience say, "and women," and of course, the women referred to that in most of those sentences, I guess all of those sentences, and the men were white men engaged in westward expansion. So that was the overview available, and then there were all these most excellent contributions to a more complex world of the West. I had grown up in Southern California, Banning, on the edge of the desert. It took me a while to think, I don't think that what I saw as a kid is represented in these books. There was an Indian reservation on the edge of town. There were many Mexican-American people who'd come in response to the opportunities. We were not far from Palm Springs, so the recreational economy and the workforce for that lived in my hometown. And so anyway, all kinds of things where I finally was thinking, something is really missing here. And hoped that somebody else who was considerably more senior would take up this, because it was inevitably going to step on toes to take up this cause. But fortunately for me, nobody else seemed to be stepping forward to do it. So that was my excellent opportunity in life, was to write Legacy of Conquest, and for a brief phase to be a punching bag of the older Western historians who, this is so funny, that writing this book, I was thinking people are going to be very happy with this book because the attendance at the Western History Association was shrinking. People were saying, in departments when the Western historian retired, it was very common in those times for the department members to say, "Oh, the Western historian is retiring. Now we can get somebody who does something important." When I went for my job interviews in 1979, people were saying, "Patricia, we're wondering, why did you go into this backwater of a field?" Well, okay. So that's the way it was, and it got me in a mood. And as I sometimes say to my students, there are different things to do with anger and frustration, and one of them is just to wallow in that, and the other is to say, okay, I'll show you. So for me, an extremely motivating event was when I had moved to the University of Colorado in 1984, and very soon after that, I was at a social gathering where some very distinguished historians had been flown in, and they were in a small group of them were chatting, and a fellow who taught at the University of Colorado who was moving to the University of North Carolina, who's a kind of American culture studies kind of guy, he said to us in this little social gathering, he said, He was moving to UNC, and once he got, in preparation for that, he was going to have to do a lot of reading in Southern history and Southern literature. And I said to him, when you moved to Boulder, did you have to do a lot of reading in Western history and Western literature? And everyone in that group, 5 or 6 people, just laughed and laughed because they thought I had made a funny joke. They thought I had made a very funny joke about how a very sophisticated man might read Louis L'Amour, Zane Grey or something. So that was a wonderful moment for me because that kept me mad. That kept me mad. And when I thought, I'm really tired of writing this thing, I would think, well, all right then. Be tired, keep going. So that is the personal story. But again, remember, I was synthesizing the work of literally hundreds of other people. That's a footnote-rich book because it was not in any means about me or just about me. So now I have ended up ready for, I guess, being placed in a natural history museum, one of those dioramas where you have the coyote in its natural habitat, and there would be me, and the little soundtrack would say, "This is Patricia Nelson Limerick, and she is the only specimen we ever found of a thoroughly contented author. We have heard of other sightings, but we have never actually seen one of these creatures, and here is a representation of her because it sort of worked out the way, actually it entirely worked out the way I'd hoped." So what I will say, I'm going to jump ahead to the point of the day here, which is that I was saying all the time to reporters and all kinds of public speeches that we were on the edge of a renaissance in Western American history. At the time I was saying it, I didn't know if that was going to, I knew that there had been a lot of good publications. Was it going to continue? Was it going to get even more innovative? So I'm saying, there's going to be a renaissance. Looking over my shoulder thinking, where's the Renaissance? And the Renaissance so totally came. It's amazing. At the Western History Association now, I mean, it was down to like 200 people attending, and now it's usually closer to 1,000. The young people are doing astounding things I would never have thought of. And that's great, except, oh, good heavens, as if we didn't have enough trouble with coverage as it was. As if we weren't trying to shoehorn. I mean, if you just take the sad fact that from when I was in graduate school and when I was writing Legacy of Conquest, 30 years have passed and all kinds of people have been president and all kinds, good Lord. So all kinds of important historical things have occurred, and somehow we're to keep shoehorning that into our semesters. So that's a little of what we're up to today, or a large part of what we're up to today is figuring out, well, first celebrating how great that there was a Renaissance in Western American history, and then saying, okay, now what? How do we do something to incorporate that richness of widened perspective without driving ourselves even madder than we are and trying to cover so much? So one of the frameworks that I was very fortunate to come up with, and the setting is so ridiculous that I probably have to take just a second on that. So I write Legacy of Conquest. It becomes controversial. Some people say some remarkable things about it. A couple of older historians took to saying to the press, oh, this is purely an attack on white men. A little bit of a presaging of, Lawrence might notice some of and to some degree, I am your problem because the complexifying of westward expansion reappeared in the 2014 controversy, again, about wanting the settlers to be more celebrated. So anyway, so I was fortunate to have the chance to take a lot of the attacks. One, Gerald Nash at University of Mexico was a nice man in lots of ways, but he wrote a thing where he called me a deconstructionist, a fascist, a Stalinist, and a deconstructionist. And if you think it's easy to be all those things at once, you must try them. And actually, some of the students at CU who knew me well said, oh, she's really not going to like that deconstructionist thing, as if I would have liked the two others. But that was great, because by obsessing about me, the resistors of change really took their attention away from the young folks coming behind me. So that turned out, I'm not sure I would really commend that as a choice to make in life. I'm not sure I made that choice, but it worked out really well. Then, these cultural patterns are just peculiar. So I'm writing that. Ivan Doig is writing his Western novels. Kevin Costner is making Dances with Wolves. So it's a curious thing that's going on in roughly the same period of time. It happens to coincide with the end of the Cold War. Is that part of what was happening? That we had to have a Ray Allen Billington style of Western history of triumph in order to be the good nation in opposition to, somebody else gets to go to work on my papers and figure it out, because I have no idea what exactly the full pattern there was. So we happened to coincide. The New York Times actually said that Kevin Costner had followed the work of Patricia Limerick, which is very peculiar because Kevin Costner is a reserved and shy person and never spoke to me about his debts to me, nor did he put any money into the Center of the American West, which is really the injury. Plus, I actually felt that Dances with Wolves was not in the mode of the new Western history, because the framework of good guys and bad guys was kept, and it just reversed. And the white folks became uniformly quite wicked, and the Indian people became quite noble, except that only the Lakota people were noble and the Pawnees were brutal and cruel. So it's sort of, I don't really care to take credit for that particular movie, but I got the coattails. So I was interviewed on Good Morning America, on the Today Show. I was interviewed by People magazine, and there was a profile of me in People magazine. So in People magazine, brevity is kind of a key. So a really good interviewer interviewed me, and she got me to say what my central message was in 4 words beginning with C. And any number of Western historians afterwards said, well, that's the best statement you ever made in your life. I thought, man, 350 pages in a book, and then I managed to go into People magazine for 4 words. So the 4 words are going to be, they're at the start of your packet, a section from Something in the Soil. If you choose to look at this, you can certainly see that. But if you are wanting to get a little bit more steering, if you turn to what is page 4 in the packet, you'll see the 4 C's lined up, starting there. The first C, continuity. The old-style frontier school had split Western history at 1890 with the end of the frontier, and really worse than split, ended Western history in 1890 as a distinctive field, which as a professional claim to say our field of study came to a halt in 1890, so pay no attention to us for the last, well, don't do that. So that, and also it seemed to me completely inaccurate that the things that people struggled over sometimes in physical combat in the 19th century, all those issues remained open in the 20th century and moved into the courtrooms, moved into legislatures, moved into contests over neighborhoods and borders between neighborhoods. But continuity was the place I really wanted to start with the, let's not cut it in half or end its significance. Let's see the past as intensely relevant to understanding our present dilemmas. I was writing very much with the recent Sagebrush Rebellion in mind, the whole rise of Western legislators asking for control over the public lands and so on. So anyway, so that just seemed like we could not talk about anything going on in a productive way, in an intelligent way, unless we saw that continuity with the 19th century. The second C, convergence, simply reflected the fact that people came from all directions into the West. And that makes our topic today a little bit humorous to think of westward expansion as the focus, when in fact there was northward expansion of Spanish and Mexican people. There was French-Canadian expansion, south and west. There was Asian expansion, crossing the ocean and coming eastward. There was Russian expansion coming into Alaska. And there were all these folks who were here, Indian people who were here. So convergence seemed to me a better model than taking any one group and concentrating on its unidirectional movement. So convergence, to see the West as one of the great meeting points of the planet. That was my second C. And again, I'm saying I, but remember, it's just a whole bunch of people writing and a whole bunch of monographs. And if I use the papal we, that might be even worse than the I, so we'll stick with I. And then the third C, which was probably the one that ignited the most agitation and anguish in some of the older historians, and certainly in some pundits and commentators in the wider world, conquest. The word frontier struck me as not useful because it is fuzzy in its definition. Frederick Jackson Turner had actually said in the famous 1893 essay, he says, the term frontier is a I can't remember, he certainly doesn't say fuzzy, but is a imprecise term which will not require exact definition. You think, stop, buddy. Do an exact definition. Everybody's going to start using the F word, so define it. But in fact, its meaning was so metaphorical and mythic that there really was no particular need to pin it down. So to me, we were sitting out. I had no idea that there would be a whole movement called world history that was, I guess, probably started coming into being. But I knew that we had, in some way that was not productive, exiled ourselves from world history, from global history, where the biggest story had been the expansion of European originating people into areas all over the planet. And so to say that those enterprises, European colonial enterprises, were exercises in invasion, conquest, imperialism, colonialism, and to say that we in the United States had a frontier zone of expanding democratic practice and opportunity, that wasn't working out for self-knowledge for us or for seeing ourselves in the larger pattern of global history. So I actually had a very fun time where I was an assistant professor. We can use our comrades and colleagues so wonderfully. I thought, looks like conquest to me. I'd like to put that forward. Then I thought, maybe the word conquest has deeply unbearable meanings that I don't know. So I had like a wonderful month and a half where I just walked around and bugged all the historians of other world areas and said, when you say the word conquest, is it inherently pejorative and condemnatory, and does it come in forms of evil and oppressed innocence? And they're going, no, actually no. And I remember a bunch of them just saying, well, you know, it varies a lot. Sometimes the conquered people, the conquerors intermarry with the conquered people, and within a generation or two, you can't really tell who's on which side of that. Or sometimes the conquerors so badly need the labor that they make some efforts to include that. A lot of times they realize that keeping the conquered people conquered, when the conquerors are outnumbered, that doesn't work. That's such a terrible expense. It drains the empire. So then you have to incorporate the conquered people in as soldiers, as allies, as trading partners. So anyway, much experimentation, which is the best. That's the kind of historical research I love the most, I guess, just chatting. I just really thought that was great. All these people had spent their lives building up expertise, and I get 12 minutes and just extract it out. So it seemed from those investigations that I should certainly use the word conquest. And in 1987, when that book came out 30 years ago, that seemed intolerable to quite a number of public commentators, but also some historians. It's so funny. I'm Lawrence, with you in your troubles in recent times. It's like, didn't we just do that? And the 2014 fight over advanced placement, it's like, am I awake? I mean, am I having a flashback here? So I guess I was having a flashback. And then the fourth C, which seems so obvious, but I really felt I had to add it, complexity. That the American West has stories that are as complex as stories from any other part of the planet, because for heaven's sake, there are human beings here. So just to say, all of these efforts to sort out the efforts are ongoing to figure out how we can put good and bad categorizations out there in what is quite a swirl. I've had a number of white liberal friends who have followed the Hopi-Navajo conflict say to me that is an easy conflict to understand, because the Navajo resisting relocation are the good Indians, and the Hopi, who had been working with coal companies, are the bad Indians. And so that's how it's easy to figure out which ones. So it's amazing. That's just one from fairly recent times where I thought, it's still going on. Well, sadly, it's complexity, and much of what we're doing with these documents today hinges on that C word, although the others are certainly involved. And then the fifth C that does not appear in any of this, and I so erred in leaving it out, is contingency. Contingency and chance, and the prospect that things could have gone differently, and that there are alternatives being passed up at every moment in history, as there are now. Some of those alternatives passed up can be reactivated, but implausible, improbable, coincidences of timing occur. Sometimes it's about an individual personality of a person who happens to be on the scene, but so much that is not a linear, fated, predictable, moving sidewalk of a journey through time. My friend Richard White was on that, was all over that. And for whatever reason, my friend Richard White didn't say, get that fifth C in, or you'll regret it. But I'm trying to make up for it. The implausibility and unpredictability is remarkable in a process that is so often seen as, here come the white folks moving from east to west. So that is, again, another factor that's very big in the documents that we've chosen today. So those 5 C's, and I guess I want to say a little bit the obvious, that there are enough reasons for young people to feel fatalistic and resigned these days, and to have a presentation of Westward expansion, Western history, reinforce that sense of inevitability. That can't be right. And so it's very lucky that we have so many ways to challenge that sense of fatalism and resignation. Okay, now does anybody have any, now that you have your historic artifact, your relic here, better than most dioramas of, any questions or inquiries about? No? Okay. It's, what's really interesting is that, and Lawrence had to leave, but it seemed for a while that the battles of those days were distant and peculiar and hard to recreate in our time as this really happened. But that's less of a problem now. In the 2010s, there's a pretty good basis for you understanding what it was that happened when people got so riled up about this. So, okay. Preparing for this event, I was thinking about how others have observed, and I wouldn't quarrel with that what happened with the so-called New Western history, and for some reason you're always supposed to say so-called, because it's now the extremely middle-aged and beyond that Western history. So what happened there was that social history finally caught up to Western history. Social history had reached colonial history, had reached Southern history, had reached certainly labor history and Midwestern industrialization history. So Westward expansion, Western history had managed to stay kind of quarantined from the methods of social history. And then finally, there was an occasion to notice how much good social history investigation had occurred and to synthesize that and to bring that together. And of course, by social history, I was thinking particularly of quantifying methods that got us a capacity to know something about the lives and stories of people who didn't write letters and leave those behind, who didn't have autobiographies or diaries or journals, but to use quantitative methods to find those people whose voices we were not able to reach. That was a great change in the workings of the profession of history. And the focus was very rightly and understandably on big movements, industrialization, urbanization, the rise of market economies, and so on. So that kind of realistic, grounded historical investigation, that's what I think finally came to Western history with the New Western history. So what I didn't think, and this is what I'm really pleased to have this chance to think, that was obviously, bye-bye, he has to go to a session where he is a captain of digital humanities, and that, which I am not. So you notice he did not invite me to join him at the digital humanities session. So there's much to celebrate in the social history thing. In retrospect, I think there was more of a trade-off in that than I realized, and I didn't necessarily participate in that trade-off, because I'm enchanted by anecdotes and tales of individuals. But I do feel overall the embrace of social history sometimes had an unintended impact of sacrificing individuality and variation in the historical stories that we were presenting. So when the big movements and the voices of the unheard recorded in census data, their very existence, that was a great change, and yet I do feel that some of the, well, the phrase that, I'm not sure this is the word I want, but the colorfulness of history got drained by that. So I'm hoping today we are finding a remedy for, we can certainly keep all the social history insights, but from time to time, shift over to a brief, but really telling and lasting moment of attention to variation and individuality in the story of the American West, and particularly in westward expansion. So I have a friend who's a really great science communicator, Randy Olson, and he visited us in February, and he said that our powers as communicators escalate if we use the formula he calls the ABT formula. And I'm sure it's a form of communication that all of us have used and use probably every moment of our lives. But when you become conscious of it, he's actually seen neurological studies that if you use the ABT method in communicating and you have persuaded people to put their heads in MRI machines, you can see that their neurons fire at a higher rate when you use ABT. And not to, go off record, but he has seen some of the impact on political campaigning that comes from the failure to use ABT. So, and we won't mention any presidential candidate whose mode was mostly and, but it is true Hillary Clinton knows a lot and wants to assert a lot, so she spends more time on the and. So here, you don't know exactly what I'm talking about here yet, so I shall now use Randy Olson's method to explain what we are doing today. This is the ABT method. It will begin with two assertions joined by and, the assertion of the context, then the contrast with the but, and then the therefore and the resolution. It's really Hegel, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Anyway, in the 1980s, the methods and approaches of social history finally reached the field of Western American history, and the old story of the triumphant movement of white men pushing the frontier across the continent was called into question and lost much of its power to set the terms of historical research. But in the last quarter century, all sorts of vigorous questions and inquiries and innovative interpretations made it clear that the history of the West was extremely complicated in a way that did not make life easy for teachers who already had too much to cover in their American History Survey courses. Therefore, we are here today to see if we can lay out a way to consider a few additions to the existing unit on westward expansion that will put on record the complexity of Western history without adding unnecessary misery to the lives of teachers and students. ABT? How do your brains feel? Did your brains feel? So actually, I've used that a few times. Don't use it right at the start, because then it's actually so effective that people will, I've given like 45-minute speeches where I start with the ABT, and you can see the audience is kind of, well, okay. Do you want to leave now? No, I don't want to leave now. So anyway, so that is our program. And I will say brevity of these sources is a key to it. That I was widowed 11 or 12 years ago, and one of the parts of that I had the attention span, I had less of an attention span than most of my students. So instead of thinking, why won't these students read? I cannot believe that they will not read full books. What's wrong with these students? I really was struck. I would sit down with a book, and the widow's mind is not a good operating mind. And so I'd start reading, I'd read 2 pages, and I'd think, I could wash the dishes. I could do that. And so just darting around. So that was actually teaching that seminar that semester was really great, just to be able to say to the students, I feel your pain. When I look at the length of this book, I think, oh, man, that's going to go on. So that is one reason why I am totally fine with brevity. I am now a champion of saying, we have lots of book discussion groups, and people have trouble keeping up. People show up at the book discussion group, they haven't read the book. So that may not be quite the thing. I mean, I think we should certainly do that when we can, but I wouldn't mind attending an occasional paragraph discussion group or a really telling sentence discussion group. And I'm hoping that that's some of what we are offering to you today, is some really tightly packed units of meaning that don't take very long to read, but appropriately take some time to think about, which is why we have our cool cover of the New Yorker cartoon, the Stop and Think. It sort of makes you stop and think, doesn't it? So, okay, so now we are going to go preparing for the more participatory, although anyone is free to speak and say anything as we go through this. I'm going to sort of give the framework of why we chose these particular documents so that when you were doing your action exercises here, you can choose among them. Sam, oh, for heaven's sake, Sam Bach, nobody thought to thank Sam. Sam Bach put this packet together and did so much to set this up, and there he is. Hi, Sam. Hi, Sam. Sam loves work at a photocopy machine. He just loves it. It's really, we also do a Gilder Lehrman Institute on this, and Sam and that photocopy machine, and scanner and all kinds of other techniques too. Anyway, so now I would like to not necessarily go through them exactly in order, but by themes, and I can tell you the pages as we reach them. So the New Western history did not displace the habit of mind of focusing on the westward movement of white people, nor should it, because that's very consequential and changes the continent and needs to be reckoned with. And yet, the units on westward expansion that often appear in textbooks and in thoughts about what students should know to be tested on in standardized testing, that oftentimes has all the adventure and excitement and sense of contingency and improbability of a moving sidewalk in an airport or any other place where you're just moving along. And the textbooks, this is a little bit of a parody of, but not entirely, that the westward expansion chapter in a textbook is often Civil War ends, railroad gets built, miners and prospectors go into the mountains, the farmers go onto the plains, the Indian wars heat up, the frontier ends, and then we get to go back to the East Coast and do what we were doing before that. So there's no way that I would recommend throw that out. Just get to the full complexity of the American West and hop around and make sure your students have no idea what it adds up to. Just keep running around looking at all the complexity. No, I am not saying that. I am so attuned to how much disorder we already have in our lives with the digital world and information coming in. So I would not say, take one thing that applies order and toss that out. And so stay on the moving sidewalk. But from time to time, take the option for one of these brief passages where you can say, we're still on the sidewalk, moving along, look over there. Look at what's happening over there. Look at this interesting variation, sometimes quite a wild variation from what we thought. So a core part of this is the complexity of white people. And as a younger person, I'm sure I would never have thought that one of my campaigns later in life would be to stand up for, not that I liked stereotyping white people or ever did that, but it seemed to me as a young person that the stereotyping ran so heavily in the direction of Indian people, Mexican American people, and Asian American people, and African American people, that the campaign was to address stereotyping of people of color and correct that. And then things started coming to my mind that complexified that idea. I was in Oakland, California, which is certainly a very diverse town. I was with a group of K-12 teachers, and a woman at lunch in Oakland, after a presentation I'd given, had said that she had been at a conference a little while before that, and on a panel where people, this was in the early 90s probably, where people were talking about ethnic history. They struggled, so they kept saying people of color, and then sometimes they would say white people, but that didn't seem to be quite the Euro-Americans. And then one poor soul who was trying hard to think, okay, I want to say something about a person who was not a person of color. That poor individual, struggling as we all have in phrasing, said, well, this non-person of color. Non-person of color. So there were just moments of thinking, there's something that really is, and it's important a project in correcting overly settled categorizations of white people. So that's a little peculiar for me to have ended up with that. And I will say, though, that I'm getting more and more geared up in that direction. in essence, it's a very simple statement that there is a huge variation in attitudes, assumptions, values, beliefs in Euro-Americans in the 19th century West. Huge. Class variations, different positions of privilege, different forms of capacity to take in information and think about it. So that is really all I am asserting. And yet I think it is easy for that to slip. Currently, the most recruit, enlisting, energy-providing way of writing about Western history seems to be settler colonialism. So have people encountered settler colonialism as a thing? It is good in lots of ways to put, it's part of this bigger project of putting American history in the broader picture of planetary history, where Europeans move out into the world and they arrive as settlers in places, and they are invaders of indigenous peoples' territory, and they take over anyway, and they raise families, and within a generation or two, they think they are the legitimate residents of that place. And that could be white South Africa, that could be white people in Kenya, that could be New Zealand British settlers, it could be Australian British settlers. And there are patterns, there certainly are patterns by which people who come from somewhere else displace indigenous people and then become the real legitimate residents in their own mind. There are other kinds of patterns of conquest where it's traders, it's merchants, it's a little army post, it's the British ladies in white dresses playing croquet in a compound where they are protected from the world around them. But settler societies, the people settle in and then they begin to think they are the really fully rightful residents. And within a generation or two, there's an erasure of the real process that brought them in there. Maybe it's not even a generation. So settler colonialism is a very widespread phrase in scholarship about the American West today. And much of great value has come out of that. So especially in terms of things like, oh my goodness, the grim processes of boarding schools, taking young people from the native societies and putting them in boarding schools, forced adoptions. So that's a really good framework. And yet I still am having the sensation that the individuality and variation dimension gets squished sometimes by that. So I guess that's the measure of being a relic, is that I lots of ways celebrate settler colonialism. I see ways in which it's added dimensions of historical understanding that are valuable in enormous ways, but I also think there's some trade-off there that we might want to renegotiate. So if we think about ways to make this point about the wide range of attitudes of Euro-Americans in the West, I hope that you will find in this packet some things that do this very efficiently. It's a curious thing that there are people, mostly public commentators, who see it some value or sense in asserting, if you raise a question about the moral conduct of a 19th century white Westerner, you're almost certain to have some public figure, if you do it in public place, say, but those were just men of their times. We can't speak of them by our standards. Right, we can't speak of them by our standards. Right. But to use that phrase, they were all just men of their times, is such a disservice to the people of the past. It's such an injustice to them in bringing them into all one like-minded peas in a pod. And I will say the phrase manifest destiny has not been our friend. And this manifest destiny just gets picked up and plunked like a very confining headgear on minds that were really more than that. So it's always good to watch that term, because it's an important term and it's got a lot of reasons to pay attention to it, but it does lose the variation. So, okay, on a interesting, so page 15 in your packet, which is, oh, it's not page 15, I wrote down the wrong page. Oh, could you help me? Yeah, I'm looking for the James and the Pike and
Yes, page 25.
page 25. Well, that's an interesting problem. My handwriting was the problem there. So if you will turn to page 25, this is, boy, speaking of the sentence discussion group, here are two sentences, or I guess there's two short paragraphs is what they are. So here we have two quotations from the first Euro-American explorers, the first American explorers to come into this region. Zebulon Pike, and then Edwin James was the chronicler of the Stephen Long expedition. So 1806 for Zebulon Pike and 1819 for the Long expedition. And there they are. They're the agents of the American government. They're looking at the West. They're assessing the West for its possibilities and potential for settlement. They arrive in the dry season. They are not here to see the spring runoff, which is a conspicuous feature of this area. They see dry creek beds, and they don't really say, why is there a dry creek bed there? There's a moment where a different kind of stance you could think, that must mean there's water in that sometimes, but they don't think that through. They don't think about dams. They don't think about reservoirs. They just look at dry, what looks to them very dry land, and they offer these impressions. And you might think, if you had bought the notion that white Americans were intrinsically expansionists, let's get this nation growing, let's do that, you would think they would be sad when they saw this really dry landscape. And they're pretty happy with this. From the immense prairies may arise one great advantage to the United States. Remember, one great advantage, he's saying here, not one miserable, oh, this is very frustrating, I'm an agent of American empire, I have to go back and tell them it's not going to work. So anyway, the restriction to some certain limits, and thereby a continuation of the Union. So here is a man, just 30 years after the Declaration of Independence, and he doesn't know if the American experiment is going to work. He doesn't know if geographical continental spread might make it too big. It might not be a workable unit for a democratic republic. So he sees a value in the fact that there is a limit, aridity, western lower levels of precipitation. He's saying, well, here's good news, which is very counter to here are these expansionists and their very blood. Our citizens, being so prone to rambling and extending themselves on the frontier, will, through necessity, be constrained to limit their extent. Yay! I mean, he is saying, yay, which is not what he should say if he were a proper manifest destiny prelude. This is before the term, obviously, but he's pretty happy about this. And then this really interesting thing, while they leave the prairies incapable of cultivation to the wandering and uncivilized aborigines of the country. So here is a white guy saying, well, here's good news. It weighs on us that we are displacing Indian people. It weighs on us. And we don't let that stop us. But here is a solution to this problem with the conflict between white settlement, which can't happen here. The land will not support, the rainfall will not support conventional agriculture. So now we found a solution to the overexpansion of the continent, into the continent of the nation, and we have also found a solution to what we will do with the way in which our good fortune is the misfortune of Indian people. So then the same sort of thing is in the next one thing, the Edwin James thing. So that, to me, is really just, if you can get that card in, if you can just play that card of saying, here's an explorer. What do you think he's looking for? What do you think he wants to report? And then just show this very striking descent from that. So that's one. Then on page 20 is what seems to be just one of the great things ever written by if somebody from the 1880s wanted to convince us that people in the 1880s were not of one mind, and some people were literally outsiders. This is the Englishman, James Bryce. He made something like 5 visits to the United States. He traveled in the West. He came back in the early 20th century as the ambassador from Britain. In 1888, he wrote a book called The American Commonwealth. And if you look at what would be page 20 in your packet. On page 20, you can see this imagined speech at the bottom of that page. It's very short, and Ken Burns uses it in his West series, so you can use the words, and Ken Burns juxtaposes it to all the forms of extraction and economic development going on, images of that at the same time, so that's quite powerful. But here is this man in the 1880s imagining a speech that he has given versions of to the Westerners he has seen, and it's just an amazing piece of prose, and if somebody made it up in a novel, you would say, could that really have happened? Well, it did. So here he is, gentlemen, why in heaven's name this haste? He's speaking to Westerners who are full speed ahead in development. You have time enough. No enemy threatens you. No volcano will rise from beneath you. He goes on to say, recognize what advantages you have. And then if we move over to the next page, why do things rudely and ill which need to be done well, seeing that the welfare of your descendants may turn upon them? Why, in your hurry to subdue and utilize nature, squander her splendid gifts? So there he is. Just so not what we thought Europeans and Americans thought in this era as they looked at the project of expansion. The end of that paragraph, you have opportunities, why hasten the advent of that threatening day when the vacant spaces of the continent shall have all been filled and the poverty or discontent of the older state shall find no outlet? You have opportunities such as mankind has never had before and may never have again. Your work is great and noble. It is done for a future longer and vaster than our conceptions can embrace. Why not make its outlines and beginnings worthy of these destinies, the thought of which gilds your hopes and elevates your purposes? So he's really calling them out. You guys are talking with positive visions all the time, so live it, huh? So live it. So it's so excellent. If I were a writer of historical fiction, and James Bryce didn't exist, I would be very tempted to make him up. It's just such a wow, look at that guy. So those are a couple of examples of ways to demonstrate the complexity of white people's minds. I'll just mention a couple very briefly. On page 42, you'll find, if I get the wrong page, please tell me, but I think I have that one right. So on page 42, you can see a weird little section. Oh, it's not. Oh, yes, it is page 42. Okay. And that is from Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln paid almost no attention to Indian people. And why was that? Perhaps he had other things on his mind. Okay, so this is not a time for armchair quarterbacking. Well, I can't think why you were so casual. But Doris Kearns Goodwin writes her book about his brilliance in choosing cabinet officials. So you think, well, that'll be interesting. What did she say about the Secretary of the Interior, who has jurisdiction over the General Land Office, Office of Indian Affairs? Well, she solves that problem by leaving them out. When she talks about how brilliant Lincoln was in choosing cabinet officers, he chose two regular old hack politicians, political appointments, who were secretaries of the Interior, who presided over the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and the corruption and so on. And that is just, it's pretty standard issue interior stuff. At one point, a group of Indian people from the Plains was brought to visit with him. And this speech is apparently close to a transcript of what he said to these Plains Indian people when he came. And I won't trouble us to go over it right now, but it's so, oh, Lincoln, where did you go? Where did you go? The beautiful rhetoric, the stunning, spirit-lifting, effective language, and it's sort of, oh my goodness, it's like a bad Hollywood scriptwriter having a public official say, oh, I don't even look at it. So I do want to look at it. That's very bad. Historians should never say that, but it's sort of, not that we can't fully understand why Lincoln couldn't move his mind and soul that way. And you may remember the famous comment when he and Mary go for a coach ride just before the assassination. And she says to him, what do you want to do when you leave office? He says, I think I would like to see the West. So there's a poignant thing about what happened between Abraham Lincoln's powers of attention and the West. But this thing is such a, and I don't know, it's not to debunk Lincoln, it's just to say, oh boy, those white people, what interesting minds they had. So there is on page 29, And one of my favorite little passages of page 29 is a story from an explorer from the Army Corps of Engineers, Joseph Christmas Ives. He actually was born on Christmas Day, so his parents called him Joseph Christmas Ives. And he had a terrible assignment. He was given the assignment to take a steamboat up the Colorado River in 1857, 1858. So he starts from the Gulf of California, and he starts taking a steamboat up the river. Most of the time, they are just on bars, sandbars. They mostly go a little ways, and then they get stuck again. And then they go a little ways, and they get stuck again. They have to keep digging themselves out. It's supposed to be a demonstration to the Indian people of the power of the American nation. It's supposed to be, oh, the Indians will see this, and they'll say, whew, we better not challenge these folks. Instead, in this passage, I think it's on page 30, he mentions that as they are laboring up the river, and it's so disheartening, they're getting nowhere, in the middle of that paragraph, if we had anticipated inspiring the Chemehuevis, our sharp-witted friends, refers to them before, with awe or admiration, we should be sadly disappointed, for I am sure they regard our method of ascending the river with unaffected contempt. They can foot it on the shore or pull along a raft upon the river without interruption, and that we should spend days in doing what they can accomplish in half as many hours strikes them as unaccountably stupid. The gleeful consciousness of superiority, at all events, keeps them in an excellent humor. When we reached the Sand Island shoals, as usual, they were awaiting the approach of the steamer at points opposite to the bars. At first, our troubles occasioned them with unqualified delight. They watched the boat with breathless eagerness as we tried in vain to get through one place after another, and every time she ran aground, a peal of laughter would ring from the bank. So just a wonderful complexifying of the traditional thinking about white Indian relations. Then the wackiest of our sources, on page 23, this is from the Gila Trail, Benjamin Butler Harris's diary of a group of folks going to California on the southern route. And I was vice president of teaching once, I know your life here. So here is this completely wacky story. So we've got several people, a group of white men who are going to California through the southern route. They are in Comanche territory, which is not to be taken lightly because relationships between Mexicans and Comanches, white Americans and Comanches are very, very tense. So if you look at page 23, at the bottom of the right side of the page, they are now having a visit with some Comanches. After much sparring, the Indians consented to come to our camp. At night, we had an interchange of amusements. The Indians entertained us with their songs, accompanied by shot, shaken, and gourds, with war whoops and jumping, which they think is dancing. So we've got a white guy sort of, well, these people look very silly. They're dancing, but they're not really dancing the way we would understand it. And then the white men respond. It's all men in this gathering. We, in turn, with violin music, danced cotillions upon the green prairie. And they do at army posts, when they would have a dance and it was all men, like half of the men would put a handkerchief around their arm and take the role of the woman and be led by the others. So for reasons that no one, I think, will ever get, they cast a cross type here in some ways. The white men play women, and the Indian dancers are the men to do this cotillion. The men are supposed to lead. The Indian men do not know the cotillion. So each, at the top of page 24 on the left side, each Indian dancer being the gentleman and each white representing the lady, I, in my cowskins, was introduced to a chief as Miss Harris and became his partner in the light fantastic toe performance. And so on. What a travesty, what a mocking of calisthenic exercises followed. The bucks, pejorative term, but the bucks, not understanding a single call, not knowing English, and never having before dreamed of or seen civilized dancing, were as dumb statues. They had to be slung and twisted about by their lady partners, jerked this way and that through the figures, until at last we gave up in fatigued merriment and retired for the night. Now, if that is not the battiest moment, it's sort of like, it's a little bit like when you're a child and you see that your parents are doing something really embarrassing and purposeful and goofy. And you think, don't do that to me. Don't embarrass me. Like, why are you doing that? That is such a ridiculous thing. One of our Gilder Lehrman master teachers said that he was probably going to use that in his class with the opening description that they're in a tense situation. The Comanches and the whites have been at war. The parties meet and then cut it off there and have the students write the next 3 or 4 sentences about what happened after that. And he thinks it's almost guaranteed, he doesn't know, but that they would say, and then a massacre occurred and so on. And the chances of anyone predicting, then they had this dance and the men just twisted their partners around ways. So I don't know, it's a wonderful, wonderful passage. So we have a couple more things on white and Indian complexity. We have I think I'll just use the very, very last one on page 60. We have a passage, it's not a primary source, it's a secondary source, though it draws intensely on a primary source. It's the most distinguished Western historian of them all, Elliott West, telling the story about E.B. Sopris, who was a participant at the Sand Creek Massacre and who spent his life proud of having been a participant at the Sand Creek Massacre and taking particular pride in having feeling that he was the person who killed a well-known half-breed, a person of mixed white Indian ancestry. So Elliott calls our attention to the fact that Sopris spent his life very pleased with himself for having been at Sand Creek and having killed the half-breed. And then Elliott goes on to tell us the story of how Sopris married an Indian woman, had a stepson who was a mixed blood person, and was enormously proud of his stepson. And Elliott just says to us basically, deal with that. Here's a man who spoke so classically contemptuously of people of mixed heritage, and then in fact married into a family and took great pride in the accomplishments of his half Indian, half white stepson. So it's different from the other passages, but it's got the same sort of, would you all just hold still and make sense for us? I mean, what are you doing to us with that? And we're going to come along, and many of us are going to try to categorize you. And would you just cooperate? I mean, for heaven's sake. So that, and then fortunately we left out, you're in our, well, you're going to be grateful for us because we left out the creepiest passage of all from science and naturalist exploration. John Kirk Townsend, this is going to be a little bit of a test. We're getting interactive very soon here. But this will be interactive right now. Okay, so we thought we put this in, and we corresponded about making sure we had the full creepy ending of it. So John Kirk Townsend was a naturalist, and he traveled with a really famous explorer, neither here nor there. So he was on the traveled through the West in the 1830s, 1833, I think, and he was in the Pacific Northwest, and he got a lot of specimens. He took a whole bunch of specimens, and there's several creatures that are named after him that have Townsend in their name, and he was very noted for his work as an ornithologist. So this is a passage that you don't have. Sam, what were we doing? Were we just trying to be kind, or what happened there? So it's just such an interesting thing. So anyway, it's the creepiest thing, and I almost thought about, let's just leave this creepy thing out, and I thought, no, there's no way I would ever say use this in a class. But I thought, you should know this, you should know this. So, okay, so John Kirk Townsend writes a passage about a tribal group in the Pacific Northwest that he is spending time with, and he is talking about a little infant, a toddler, who was making little overtures to him, and he says, in essence, if she died, I would preserve her in alcohol and take her back as a specimen. Which, of course, that happens. George Morton at the time, and that's the thing that happens. But there's a toddler, and there's an adult man, and the toddler and the adult man are sort of crossing a culture, and then he's thinking, well, I could take her home. preserve. So it's such a dark, dark moment. And since a lot of what I am trying to say here is, there's Sophros who says, I love my stepson. I just felt like there should be one thing in here that just says it's probably worse than we thought, because it's not a battlefield moment. It's not a moment of deep passion and him feeling threatened. It's just him utterly dehumanizing another human. So we left it out. And the question for you is, do you want us to send you that? Or do you want to thank us for not giving it to you? So, and again, nobody, I can't imagine, I can certainly imagine using it in a college class or maybe I don't know, high school, I don't know. So how many of you would like us to send that to you? Okay, we'll do it. Okay. It's just, all righty, we'll do that. Then we have a couple of examples. Page 32, a tough woman on the Overland Trail who just single-handedly takes out the white women as frail. It's a number of pages from that. She's Amelia Stewart Knight. She's just out there, and she is very tough, and she is very pregnant. She doesn't go on about that, but she has a child in the midst of the trip. She has a whole bunch of kids, and anybody who's thinking that, oh, the West was hell on horses and women, well, some horses, some women, but she is just a fine, fine corrective and antidote to the notion of feminine stereotypes of frailty. Same thing for several things from our collection here, right, from the Denver Public Library, page 43 to 56, to women. And that's an important thing to include. Sam chose that one because it has the handwriting, which would be very difficult, we think, for many students today to deal with, or maybe for us too, but has the transcript of against wonderful challenge to the stereotyping of women by showing that one particular person's frailty. And then, for reasons that I'm not quite sure, we wanted to give you the Frederick Jackson Turner Frontier Antithesis. That's right at the beginning, right after the 4 C's. And we wanted to give you that because you were still, I think, sometimes asked in courses, this would be page 7 in the packet, to contrast. The AP practice exam had a question comparing the thought of Patricia Limerick from the thought of Frederick Jackson Turner. So you feel a little pickled in alcohol yourself at that moment, just sort of preserved as an artifact. Not the festive kind of alcohol, the other kind. So that comes up, and the Turner thesis, you still have to run into that from time to time. And the thing that's here on page 7 is a very weird thing I did in writing about Turner, of taking quotations from Turner that sound so not Frederick Jackson Turner and compiling them. So that's the Frontier Antithesis by Patricia Nelson Limerick, or by Frederick Jackson Turner with the assistance of Patricia Nelson Limerick. Just things where he talks about the industrial warfare of mining in the Rockies. So it's just even that Turner won't hold still for us. He turns out to be a much more complicated guy than if you're just doing the regular old 1893 Frontier thesis from the Chicago Fair. So, okay, so that's a quick survey of the sources, and then one that we didn't put in, but we'll send because it will be a wonderful antidote to our terrible Townsend thing. This is a passage that I came upon right after Legacy of Conquest came out. It was published in print, couldn't do anything to get this in, but I still wondered this second, if I had read this passage, I think it would have forced me to get earlier on this, let's really pay attention to the complexity of white people's minds in the West. So I was working on a project, exhibit on trails, and I was reading trail narratives and autobiographies and reminiscences. This is from a man named Bernard James Byrne. It's not in the packet, but we can include it. Next one, who wrote a memoir about his time as a frontier army surgeon in New Mexico and Colorado in the 1880s. And this is a quotation from his reminiscence and autobiography. Here he is in Santa Fe, 1880s. As I walked along the street in Santa Fe, I stopped several citizens to ask the way. No one could speak English. The answer to each question was, "Quien sabe?" I finally got indignant to think of walking a street in my own country and not being able to find a citizen who spoke the language. But I cooled off when I reflected that Indians and Mexicans had been here ages before I was. I was the interloper. So Bernard James Byrne left a record of his life and thought that leaves that common idea of a homogeneous, standardized, white American perspective on westward expansion, that leaves that idea in tatters. That is a good reason to pay attention to him. It is not a reason to think of him as typical and representative, but it is a reason to keep an eye on him as he reminds us of that complexity, improbability, contingency of Western history. So those are my remarks. I'm bowing to say, or I'm curtsying to say that's the end of my remarks. Yay, said my remarks. So, although, no, that was me just saying we can move on, and not saying, oh, you must all clap. And I said, yeah, it wasn't that. So if there's a question or two before.
We have time for questions. I wanted to just be sure people had time for questions.
That's a great thing. I never quite realized that clapping could mean, oh, we enjoyed that very much, or it could mean, oh, thank heavens it's over. So either way, I probably have clapped both ways plenty of times in life. So, okay, any questions or thoughts or comments? Yeah.
Yeah, just on this idea of like complexity of whiteness, thinking about one connection to like recent trends of viewing white as also a race now.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
even what you presented here is very similar to what you see within the abolition movement, right? That there's this, there's these complexities of whiteness, some one that are make it very complicated to
Right.
pigeonhole people, but
Right.
at the same time, there's still this underlying preservation of the status quo. So I think it's interesting, even in the last example
Right.
we read, there's these mindsets that are the status quo.
Right.
So how much of like what you have seen in this complexity is, yeah, there's this complexity, but there's not enough to shake up what the status quo
Right.
at the time, or there's this lack of willingness to
Right.
shake up. So
Right.
similar to abolition, yes, slavery's wrong. However,
Yeah.
they're not equal in society.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great point. And I think it is one of the great paradoxes of this whole angle of thought that Army officers are sometimes the most challenging in their reflections, not, as you would just noted, not in their actions. Sherry Smith's book, The View from Officers' Row, has this whole set of people who are Army officers who are not able to have a simple view of we are bringing civilization, or so that actually Army officers are positioned to be the most, not all of them by a long shot, but to be some of the most thoughtful on that. I guess if the story were over and came to some just full closure, I'd think, well, this is of antiquarian interest. They had interesting minds. Well, that's nice. I suppose some of them wrote poetry. I suppose. I mean, it would not be much. It would just be that. But I just feel like Byrne, this is where, well, I don't even know if it's a religious perspective, but he has not left us. He's still here. And I don't think that anybody on the transition team of the president-elect has a clue that anyone like Bernard James Byrne existed. I think it's something that we want to see as part of our heritage. And since you can get places in life in political dispute by referring to our heritage and by citing our predecessors, then I would like to widen the pool of the predecessors we cite and to say, I just as soon forget about Townsend, obviously that can go, but for these guys, I think, you know, those are our forefathers, foremothers, and I want them to be honored. And I don't want the others to be erased. I'm actually fine with the fact that you all want to see this wretched Townsend passage. I'm fine with that. But I just feel like it's still ongoing. It's not, it's litigation on behalf of Indian rights continues, and Indian people are so forceful in our world and so active. So I think it's something, and I'm sure it comes from my total word orientation, that seeing words on a page just and so I want Byrne present. I want him recognized as part of our shared heritage. And what comes of that, I mean, I guess where I'm really struggling, because I actually have put a lot of public intellectual life into trying to do that kind of thing. And then every once in a while people say, and have you had an impact? I think, well, I don't know. I mean, I've met a lot of very interesting people and had some very nice trips to interesting places. So I think if we had a more orchestrated way of applied history, of using those kinds of examples to say, by all means, let's reckon by our heritage, but let's make sure it's a full record of our heritage. I think that could matter. Well, we'll see. I guess we'll see. And really, the election results sure back me up, don't they? I mean, that's really great to see. It's been a very difficult time for all of us, I guess, on that, but just thinking, why are we back having the dispute, the stuff, the vitriol unleashed at me in 1987? Why did that come out again for the advanced placement test revision in 2014? What is that about? So there is a session, by the way, at 3:30 today, Mile High Ballroom 3B on the advanced placement controversy in Jefferson County. So I think that will be really worth watching. Fritz and I are there. So any other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
I'm going to try and ask this using your analogy. When you talked about continuity and the idea that the West doesn't end in 1890, if we are on the moving sidewalk where we only have the time to do little features off of that as we go, what would you feature off of Western history past 1890 that you don't think we're covering at this point? Because you're right, I mean, so much of the focus goes back to the east at that point, but we've only got time to hit 2 or 3 featured elements. What should we get?
Well, I wrote an essay quite a few years ago in the Journal of American History on American history textbooks and their treatment of the West. So there's some quite spelled out examples there. In some ways, what I was saying there is just, if you're going to do when you're doing the civil rights movement, do the civil rights movement in Albuquerque, do the civil rights movement in Southern California. I recognize that the Latino and African American activism, so it's do the civil rights movement, but then go west for a moment on that. So some of it is just take what you were going to be doing anyway. Do the Cold War. You would be doing the Cold War. Do how much the legacy of the 19th century Western story offered the seemingly ideal places for nuclear weapons development. So note how aridity, if you did Pike and Long and you did aridity, then you're perfectly set up to do, why was that Los Alamos and the Hanford site in Washington for producing plutonium, and then a little bit later, the Nevada test site, why were those lands so lightly occupied? Why was it so easy to take the human beings who lived there and call them, the pattern was often to call them virtually uninhabited places, which some of the ranchers and Indian people there are going, virtual uninhabitants? What are we here? So it doesn't, there's just a whole range of those kinds of things to take what is crucial to the planet, the creation of nuclear weapons, and to say, why was the balance of that activity in the West? And how does that follow? I mean, in essence, Pike is saying, let's take our problems with Indian people and solve them by removing them to the West. And that's a pattern that continues. When we have a problem, we have nuclear waste. Oh, well, what should we do with that? Oh, let's find a disposal site in the West. Let's find a, so there's that pattern of we take our problems and we export them to the West. So it doesn't really matter to me which of those things that you, I don't know that I would prioritize them, but just when you're doing what you would be doing rightly and appropriately anyway, you do a little moment on what's going on with the West. The people running Ronald Reagan and his cowboy hat and his horse and the appeal of that, what was happening there. Barry Goldwater is a different form of Westerner running it. So just to notice how often Westerners appear in these symbolically charged moments. So, but that essay, I think it was like 1992 in the Journal of American History. It's called The Case of the Premature Departure. Because basically what was happening was exactly that the West was just gone after 1890. So I was using that phrase premature departure to bring it back in. But I think you'd find some things there. Plus there's some funny stories about poor textbook writers who just know that the states are all big squares or rectangles here, and so they get them confused, and they send the Union Pacific Railroad and Central Pacific Railroad across Colorado, which is going to be very difficult for kinds of reasons. So there's comedy as well as. So.
I'll give you 2 more examples. I'm Fritz Fischer, by the way. I'll introduce myself.
So should we bring?
Later. But you could, if you're doing labor, you could do Ludlow.
The primary resource sets really quick because all of them have exactly that.
Colorado, Thomas
Primary resource sets that we do.
Yeah.
Because there's Kyoto, there's Lincoln Hills, there's...
Yeah.
There's a brand new book by a teacher here in Denver,
Bill Philpott wrote a book called Vacation Land, which, so for those of you here in Colorado, I assume most of you are from Colorado, it talks about the birth of the I-70 corridor and the whole idea of suburbanization and development, and how Colorado looks like it does now versus, a lot of kids, when they learn Colorado history in 4th through 5th grade, they learn about miners and trappers, and then the class is over.
Yeah.
And they don't understand why Colorado looks like Colorado looks. And that is one book and one way you can do that.
And that's part of what I was getting at, was trying to do that in later times.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, good Lord, extractive industry and fracking in Pennsylvania and New York, just asking for those kinds of comparisons with Western locales. Sam reminds me that at the Southern American West, we have a very nice little project that our governor asked us to, he was convinced that Texans care about Texas history, and that makes them better Texans because they have to take all these courses in Texas history, and so they are more loyal to their state. And so we have a project, the Governor's Love Colorado initiative, and we have resource sets, including primary sources, or focused on primary sources on Mesa Verde, Bent's Fort, the Japanese internment camp at Amache, the town of Kyoto, the African American resort, Lincoln Hills. So that's, we have,
By real classroom teachers.
yes, and we have a little stamp that says reviewed by
Real teachers.
real teachers. So do we have these to pass around, or do I should I
There's a
just?
stack of them over there, and then there was a
Oh.
stack one over here, so that
Okay.
should be enough. But they're all posted on our website, which is just centerwest.org.
And we will be doing our Gilder Lehrman Westward expansion thing next summer too, if that's of interest on how to use these things in a more sustained way. So any other questions, or? Yeah, please.
I would like to question the movie that Leonardo DiCaprio made, The Revenant.
Yes.
How, I remember thinking, how historically accurate was that movie?
I so intended to see that thing, and I didn't. So I'm flawed, as I am in so many ways. But the Hugh Glass story is sufficiently astounding that I must see it. I know I must see it, but it just seems like one of those things where it's, why would you need to exaggerate? This man left for dead, that happened, by his trusted friends, that happened, and then he crawls for miles and lives, and then he reappears, and the trusted friends go, uh-oh, look who's still here. I mean, that happened. So the core story is there, and I just think I'm happy about that movie because they were courageous, and they let Leonardo DiCaprio look not so cute. And so the notion that they would actually take somebody so cute and get them all. So I think that's a brave moment on the part of Hollywood, because people go, oh, Leonardo DiCaprio, he's so cute. And how nice to just play with that. But I'm so sorry, I'm really not good. John Coleman, a former student of mine, wrote a book about Hugh Glass, and he has several op-ed pieces out there. So actually, that's what I should have just said at the beginning, that I am of no use to you on this question. But Coleman, C-O-L-E-M-A-N, just Google Revenant John Coleman, J-O-N, not J-O-H-N, J-O-N. He's at Notre Dame, and he will say everything that I should have been able to say to you. So that is the great thing. These former students, good Lord, they just, and that's part of that Renaissance in Western American history. John also did a very fine book on wolves and the extermination of wolves. Almost more than you can read sometimes, the brutality of that. But there's another thing on wildlife issues. I'll just say this, the continuities and I guess maybe for a while I was a little bit too fixed on we must all pay attention to the West. And I wasn't building my bridges with just as I say now, fracking in Pennsylvania and New York, we must do that. But I met a person who is the wildlife officer for the New York City parks. And she is so interested in Western history and wildlife management, and now is attending conferences where she is from Manhattan. She's from New York City, and the issues of the wildland-urban interface where the wildlife have been maintained, the coyotes that are just appearing around different boroughs in New York. So it's in the weirdest way, we all ended up back together. We were the region with aridity problems. Then water pollution, water contamination in the eastern US, they managed to replicate some of the problems of water shortage. There's been droughts in Georgia, Alabama. There's a big contest between Georgia and Alabama about water. So we end up not saying, oh, quit paying attention to the East, but notice how much the issues of the West, time passed and they became Eastern issues as well. So, I mean, you could see actually Easterners showing up at Western water conferences as long as 10 or 15 years ago, just thinking, this wasn't supposed to be our problem. Here we are.